They can become more fatigued, less motivated. Physiologically, they can lose motivation. And we're sitting here and having a very intense conference while we sip our water nearby. We don't have to think too hard about where we're going to go if we get a drink. But can you imagine having this discussion if the room was 110 and you didn't have any water? How much would you be paying attention? Or, conversely, if we didn't have adequate water, how much would you care about anything else other than getting water? So, one of the things that we need to be also thoughtful in looking at is what is water and how does it really work for us? And we need to do some more research in that area. One of the things we really know is about thermal regulation. That is, when we're hot or we're thirsty, we need water. But it's a whole lot more than that. What does that have to do with anything? Well, it has to do with our ability as human beings to provide for ourselves and to provide for each other for our basic human needs. So we could look at the biology of things. Interestingly enough, the European Food Health Authority said there's really no gold standard out there about what adequate water is. So while we're arguing the points about right to water and water adequacy, we need to have a much more intelligent look at just what does that mean. And if you think about the people of the world who are disenfranchised, who are marginalized, who are doing heavy labor, who are the subjects and victims of human trafficking, can you imagine trying to survive under those conditions without adequate water? So to me, it intensifies the need to come together and to bring to bear many different disciplines in working with this particular issue. So there's the biological for you. And the psychological is just as important. We know that from limited research, and again, the interesting thing is that a lot of the research is done on what I call the hardy well. If you look at some of the research that's done on people in the military, or it's done on people and athletes, and they're saying, what happens when you get dehydrated? And most of the studies that I came across were using what I call the hardy well, which again gives us a very skewed standard of what that is. But even with the hardy well, if there's a 2% or more deprivation of water hydration, in other words, it's inadequate, we find that people can become more confused. It affects their reasoning ability. It affects their ability to sort out problems and think through things. And I'm thinking of you law students that tank up on caffeine and tea and Coke and things like that. That stuff dehydrates you. So if you want to pump up your IQ a little bit, have some water instead. But we know that. We know that. Again, so what happens if you don't have adequate water in terms of your thinking process, in terms of your ability to reason? Can you function as well? No. Does that compromise you in some way? Yes. So again, we can add that to the populations that are marginalized, that are doing the work. And so not only are they physiologically compromised, they are compromised in other ways as well that affects not only their quality of life, but their ability to be able to move beyond just the basics of survival. I think Professor Larson, you had talked about spiritual practices. And I think that's an essential one. And you talked, I believe, about some of the Aboriginal practices. And I'm not a lawyer, but I think the case you were talking about was Navajo Nation versus Arizona. So I did some homework there. And in that case, you were talking about indigenous people. Then we're talking about the need, the right for pure water. But it's not just indigenous people, because religions all over the world use, including Christianity. Now, can you imagine here in the United States taking away clean, pure, holy water in religious practices? What would that mean to people? How would they feel about that? Would they feel compromised in some way in terms of their right to religious freedom? So that is an issue because dear to heart, when everything is said and done and when you're at the last straw, sometimes what people hang on to is their faith and their spiritual practices. And for many cultures throughout the world, including the United States, spiritual religious practices are built into the very fabric of life. So one might argue without clean, adequate water to have one's religious freedom to practice in ways that are meaningful, does that get compromised too? There's another piece that goes along with that. We were talking earlier, and I think we've mentioned about the need to have civil rights for women and children in particular, as well as all people. Now imagine if we were a village, okay, this whole room, that we're a village, and we need water. And the closest water that we could possibly get would be, let's say, 20 miles away. You with me so far? We're a village. We need water. Somebody has to go get the water. Who's going to go get the water? Now, if I told you who's going to get the water are probably going to be raped or captured into human trafficking or violated in some way, would you want to go be the one to get the water for your village? What if I said, well, everybody whose first name begins with the letter L, let's just decide that one. All the people, you don't have to raise your hand, but if your name begins with the letter L, you're going to be the ones designated to go out there in harm's way every day and subject yourself to that. And the farther we put that source of water away, the more danger you're at. Now let's add children to the mix too. Would you want to send your child out to go get water? Anybody? I wouldn't send my dog. She's my child. Okay. So are you getting the picture? I mean, it's a human right that has to concern all of us, because when we put it in personal terms, when it affects us directly, things change. So that we have to be concerned about being the voice for those who have no voice. We have to be concerned about those who do not have civil rights. And we have to be thinking about being able to put ourselves in their situation, and it makes this discussion much more personal and much more intense in some ways. So if we look at the biological, there's questions that we have to answer about adequacy. If we look at the psychological and emotional that includes the spiritual, we have a vested interest in trying to make water adequacy for all people. And then the last thing is, in terms of, the last piece is the function of water adequacy in terms of empowerment. Now my background as a social worker is, I've specialized in working with people who have been traumatized, both kids and adults. And I've studied trauma. And one of the interesting things that I've learned in the practice and study of trauma is that there was some interesting research by Amnesty International in '73 that still holds up today. Amnesty International discovered, interestingly, that the uses and forces of power with political prisoners and prisoners of war were the same strategies that were actually used in domestic violence. In other words, the strategies were very much the same. And one of the most universal strategies out there is that you deprive the person, or your victim, or your prisoner, call it what you will, of food and water, and you control that. You control that in all ways. And it's universal in its power to keep people controlled. If you add to that inadequate water, inadequate food, so that you're physiologically compromised, your reasoning is affected, your judgment is affected, you create a more willing or pliable victim. That's why the control of water, particularly because we need that above all, even above food, is a weapon of coercive control. So if we can think about, yes, the laws present a whole complex web of questions that are far beyond me to ask. In fact, we're talking about that today. And we've heard some of them. But at the same time, I have to think that people make laws. People are involved in the crafting of laws in some ways. So we have to think about, as we're talking about this issue, we have to think about our women and children being subjected to torturous and hazardous conditions to get water. Are we controlling large populations? And I think those throughout the world, including parts of the U.S., have a very vested interest in maintaining control over populations. So water then becomes, I think, one of the ways to think about it, is a weapon of political control. And do we need to do something about weapons? We talk about arms control, right? Gun control, right? Well, water is a very, very powerful weapon. So I hope that in our discussion tonight, in the after discussion of the panel, and then tomorrow, we kind of think about some of these things in terms of how water works. There's lots of things we need to know about water does, and we still have to research and find out. So when we're talking about adequacy, we know what we're talking about. We know what people really need. So that if we're arguing for adequacy, we can be articulate and mindful about that. So those are some of the thoughts that I have tonight in terms of water and water adequacy. And I wanted to leave you with a short story. You know, it's easy, it's very easy to get totally overwhelmed with this whole discussion and overburdened with this discussion. And certainly I don't minimize the complexities of things in any way, shape, or form. But I also have to draw inspiration to keep us going and to keep us mindful of things. So I want to finish with a short story that I hope is inspiring to you in some ways. Now, some of you may have heard of Rachel Beckwith, but for those who don't, my inspiration comes from a 9-year-old child. And Rachel's story is something like this. On June 12th of this year, 2011, Rachel posted that she had a wish. She had a birthday, and instead of having presents, she had read about the millions of children who die every year before the age of 5. Now, this is the 9-year-old child. So Rachel had a modest wish. Rachel's wish was that she wanted to raise $300 to send children clean drinking water. That was her birthday wish. Sadly, Rachel died from injuries sustained in a car crash on July 23rd of this year. She had raised $220 of her birthday wish. But Charity Water, Rachel's site, has continued to live on. And today, it has raised over $1 million to provide fresh drinking water to children of the world. So we've got a child, and I like, through the eyes of a child, they cut through the legal, they cut through the social, they cut through the political. She says, this is what we need. I can do something. I can do something. So I hope today and tomorrow we draw some inspiration from this little 9-year-old child who was quite remarkable and quite visionary, and maybe gives us hope. Let's not ever, ever give up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all the panelists for their great presentations. Now we move into the question and answer phase. I think we're doing very well on time. We've been informed that we actually have this room until 9:30, so we have plenty of time for questions. I'd like to open it up, first of all, to our one of our student co-directors, Melanie Millay, to come forward to ask her question, and then we're going to have open it up to everybody to step forward to either this microphone here or that mic to ask questions. Please note that you can direct your questions either to the entire panel or to a specific panel member of your choice.
Hello, this question is for Ms. Axelrod. If the U.S. were to recognize water as a human right, would that change the work that you do with the Department of Interior?
Gosh, you know, I really don't know. Probably. It's interesting because I can't remember if it was, which one of you sort of sparked this in my mind, but this conversation about rights to clean water is a conversation that is a constant one in South Florida. I showed you pictures of the Caloosahatchee River. The Caloosahatchee River is in devastated shape all the time. I mean, that particular photograph was one particular topic, algae bloom, but just pick your month and the Caloosahatchee is going through hell, basically. And the activists over there have really attached themselves to rights language. And they've said, you know, our estuary, our economy, our beaches, our livelihoods, we have a right to clean water. And we have a right to water supply. Some of those problems are caused by the lack of water, eutrophication. And as it turns out, they don't have a right in Florida to any water at all. The environment doesn't have a right to water. And I think if suddenly there was a right, it would dramatically change. I'll say that without any opinion as to whether it would be better or worse, but it would dramatically change the path that we're on. Thank you for the question.
I have a question for Shannon Estenos. Could you
Oh,
comment?
sir, I would ask you to use the microphone so you can get it. You can hit the button at your desk, actually.
Oh, great. I've never been on this side of these.
And just so everyone knows, that's Professor Richard Grosso. He actually knows this panel very well.
Now we are now.
How do you do these things? I hold this down? All right, great. Shannon, could you comment generally on the role and relationship of large-scale ecosystem restoration in South Florida and the world and its potential to increase water supplies for human consumption?
Yeah. Actually, it's a good question. I think that it's one leg of a three-legged stool for us here in South Florida. One of the ways that we were able to gain political consensus to invest billions of dollars in water resource management and infrastructure in South Florida was this idea that it would increase the availability of water for all uses and all demands, not only ecosystem demands, but also human consumption as well. And I think that that's what ecosystem restoration, when you think of it from a water perspective, water resources perspective, that's what it's all about. It's about thinking about how we develop our water resources in a way that take into account consumptive uses and the demands of ecosystem. Now, I will say this, that in South Florida, hold on to your hat, we use about 165 gallons per person per day, which is obscene. And there are some communities who shall remain nameless, Boca Raton, who use something like 300 gallons per person per day. And so, you know, there are other ways of also making more consumptive, you know what I'm saying, increasing water availability for all as well. Oh, and by the way, most of that is used on irrigating lawns, by the way.
Yes.
Well, I think this was kind of going to be to the general group, but it starts out with what Shannon's been talking about, and I think I just would like an elaboration. I think you've already said that wildlife don't have any rights in Florida for water, and I was wondering that in the face of this century being the greatest of the 6th grade extinctions on Earth, the news that I read in the newspapers during our drought seasons in the winter is that wildlife really get hurt. And that usually comes from a speaker, Audubon, whatever. And of course, you also talked about water going 50% or more. I think that was what you used towards landscaping. Do you foresee that there's ever will be a time that wildlife will have more rights to water than the landscaping does? Is there any route that could occur?
Well, I am not the expert. I'm completely intimidated by these questions about rights because I am so not an expert in what the ramifications of the word right is. We have in Florida, no one has a right to water. You use water by a regulatory device. You use it through the use of a permit. And wildlife and ecosystems don't get to apply for a permit. And so that's why they don't have there's not a mechanism for them to have an allocation of water. I sort of agree with Professor Donahoe that I see the opposition to granting particularly ecosystems and wildlife a right to water. I see the opposition being insurmountable. And frankly, I'm not sure, at least here, that it's necessarily necessary for it to come in the form of a right. There are other mechanisms for getting wildlife and people the water that they need without necessarily having to establish a right to it. But the last thing I'll say is that the rhetorical value, for example, of those Caloosahatchee advocates is enormous because the word right to lawyers means one thing, but to the general public, it's just it means it offends my sense of what's right and wrong, and a lot of times that's all that's necessary to get a political dialogue going, and then to start building a political consensus around some other solution.
Thank you.
Doug, do you have anything to that? Yep.
I would say that there is, taking it out of the context of a human right, there's a growing movement in water law here in the United States that beneficial use includes in-stream uses. So back in the olden days of water rights law, in order to perfect your right to say that you owned water, you actually had to physically divert it out of the stream, and leaving it in the stream just didn't count. It was considered wasteful. But in most states now, an in-stream use of your water right is considered beneficial. And one of the things that actually happened in the Shoshone and Arapaho case in the Wind River Code was they established on their reservation that an in-stream use counts as beneficial use. So you could buy water rights and leave them in the stream as the owner, and it functions something like a conservation easement. And a similar approach has been taken recently with the drought that we're seeing in Africa, where we've seen a lot of conflicts between the Maasai and elephants. And elephants actually develop some of their own water resources. They actually kind of kick up their own water. And there have been conflicts actually between elephants and Maasai people over water holes. And there have been developed governmental conservation easements on behalf of wildlife. So the idea of like asserting a human right, since they're not human, I don't foresee that. But there are ways to protect wildlife through water that sort of exist that do have legal mechanisms.
Are you saying that movement is whether it's east or west? Because I do believe there's a difference. I don't know.
Well, the idea of beneficial use is a Western concept in water law, so that's more what I'm talking about.
Although, can I just add something? In Florida, when I was talking about the consumptive use permitting process, there is a three-pronged test of beneficial use. The burden on the applicant to prove that the use is beneficial is a requirement. Now, golf courses are beneficial uses, as are water parks, as are water fountains, decorative water fountains. So we could have a debate about what, in cases of scarcity and shortage, and increasing scarcity and shortage, the definition of beneficial use, in my opinion, it should be up for grabs. But traditionally, beneficial uses are basically anything that's not destroying the water resource.
I see a couple hands up.
You said that you divert trillions of gallons of water into the ocean every year, but at the same time, you also say that there are parts of the states and in the country, suppose that all also suffer from drastic floods. And since you said that you're changing the infrastructure of how, like the canal, have you, well, not you personally, but the department been thinking about how to divert the water they dump in the ocean to the places that get dry, so they wouldn't have to suffer the severe droughts like that?
That's it. That's what we're doing. We are. That is precisely the key to Everglades restoration: is to stop dumping water out when it's raining. Instead, put it someplace else. The problem with water is that it physically occupies space, and we don't have these wonderful snow-capped mountains that pack up water and hold it. You know, when I was just in the Northwest with my family for over the summer on vacation, and we were dipping our feet in a freezing cold stream in August, and that occurred to me that that water, that snow melt, was precipitation that had probably fallen in February up in a mountain. It wasn't flooding anybody, wasn't hurting anybody, and then the temperature warms up and it comes and it fills the streams. Here in Florida, when a drop of rain hits the ground in June, it has to go somewhere. And there's either a place to put it where there are no people, or it's going to go where your house is. And so the flood protection system is designed to get it away from your house. And when they thought there were only going to be 2 million people here, there was plenty of water to go around. But now that there are 7.5 million, now when it's raining, we need to put it someplace other than the ocean, so that when it stops raining, we can go back and get it. Once it's in the ocean, it's gone. Then you have to desalinate it, and it's gone, essentially. So that's precisely what we're doing, taking those trillions of gallons, trying to hold it so that we can use it during droughts. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Todd, okay, 1, 2, 3. Todd, Amy, and go ahead.
I have a question for Professor Larson. You talked about, or at least the doctor talked about, water as a weapon of political control. And my question is more about water as a weapon of religious control. Because you discussed the Altunians in Russia. And my question is that suppose I'm an Altunian in Russia, and I don't want to practice that religion. Do I have to live a diasporic existence, walking around searching for a nomadic tribe that's going to accept me because I accept their religion? So, I mean, to what extent is your argument about religion and its acceptance? Do I have to accept your religion in order to drink your water?
Well, it sort of goes to the heart of the question of what is religion. For example, there's a lot of people who live on the Shoshone and Arapaho reservations who are Christian or atheist or whatever they are, but their cultural tie to their history is still very strong. So they still celebrate their religious ceremonies, even though it's not something they believe. It's still something. It's a culture that they try to preserve. So it strikes at, you know, what exactly is religion? And at least in the context of even United States First Amendment jurisprudence, as well as in the international context, religion is defined pretty broadly. If you look at civil and political rights, it's not just religion, but it's also thought and conscience. So I think it's a pretty broad.
What if your religious conscience tells you that unless I accept your religion, you will not give, because religion has all sorts of variances and all sorts of tolerations and all sorts of forms. So my question is, and I'll take it further, what if your religion won't supply me water if I don't accept your religion? Then where does your argument, I just don't understand how you use that as a legal resource and force me to subscribe to your religious practice, whatever your interpretation of religion may be, that if I don't accept the religion, I don't get the water, and I have to look for other places to get the water. I think it's very concerning to me.
I think you're misunderstanding my argument.
I think I am. I have to read, obviously, and maybe I misinterpreted it, but
I don't think that in fact, the reason that I propose the framework that I do is because there is a danger of a religion based on some sort of broad interpretation of its rights monopolizing a water resource, and that's not right. Which is why you have this concept of reasonableness. They can't just say, we get all of the water because it's sacred to us. They have to say, we get a certain amount of water, which we put to reasonable use.
For everyone? Reasonable use for everyone, or reasonable use for those who...
Reasonable use to the court.
Okay, thank you.
we'll be covering religion a little more depth in our First Amendment class together tonight.
Thank you.
Amy, former student director of IACHR. Amy Shenstone.
My question is to Dr. Palmer. Dr. Palmer, you spoke about the use of water as a method of political oppression, and I know you have quite a background in working with survivors of trauma and abuse and such. And so my question to you is, have you seen deprivation of water used by abusers in your social work practice and here in the U.S. in the mainstream, or is it really just a method of political oppression? And also, I know you were here last year for the Human Trafficking Symposium, and you've done work with survivors of human trafficking, and have you seen water deprivation used to control that as well?
Okay, did you all get the question about, if I could reiterate in case they didn't hear, the question was, have I seen or worked with people where water has been used as a form of deprivation to maintain control, both in terms of domestic violence or with children, as well as human trafficking? Is that it?
Right.
Okay. Well, most of my experience is at the family level or at a level with families and children, and the answer is yes. What makes the use of water and food so powerful is often coupled with control of toileting and bathing. And so the way you begin to control a person is not only control their food and the water intake, because we know without water, then we become compromised pretty quickly. The intent behind control of another person, the intent is just that, to create a person that I can manage, that I can control in all ways, whether it's a child or whether it's an adult, so that that person is compliant with my wishes. The worst thing for somebody who is a perpetrator of abuse, who has to use power and control, is unpredictability. Okay? So how do I make somebody predictable? I control the very things that they need for survival, because people will do what they have to do to survive. And so in the process of trying to survive, if my survival depends on getting the water from someone, I'm going to do what I have to do to get water from someone. And so it becomes very effective. The toileting also becomes a very powerful weapon. And you can't, talk about food and water and we don't talk about toileting, but the fact of the matter is we're human. And that is what is so embarrassing and so humiliating. The first time I came across that was looking about the survivors of the Holocaust, when they were put into cattle cars and they were shipped to the death camps. And many of those survivors wrote about the total humiliation and embarrassment of defecating on themselves. So the way I create a compliant victim is, yes, I control the water, I control the food, and I control the toileting. Now I could back that up with the use of power and force, and sometimes I do, but that's not necessary. I have these other kinds of weapons. I do not have direct observation in terms of human trafficking, but I know from looking at all kinds of prisoners in all kinds of ways that those universal needs are exactly what Amnesty International came up with. There's called a Bitterman's Chart of Control, and it talks about how it doesn't matter who you're trying to control. Food, water, toileting, those are the most powerful weapons. I hope that answers your question.
Well, I would just like to pose a follow-up to that to Doug. What do you think of the sort of applying this water right in a narrower way? I know you expressed some reservations about the right to water. With the concept of, at the very least, the right to water means you can't use it as this form of control, the most extreme forms.
Well, there are probably a lot of ways you can think of more narrow interpretations of what the right might entail or when it would be used that might make it an effective way to do the most important part of this, would be to make sure that people had access to that water which is necessary for their health and so on. So there are many possibilities there, and I really wasn't suggesting that those aren't there.
I promise.
Oh,
Go ahead.
Sorry, I stepped out. I had two questions for our civil engineer, and myself has nothing to do with law. I'm a former journalist. The first question was in regards to what you were asking, Raquel. If you were to say, take all the water that got dumped on for months and transport it to Texas where they have this severe drought, wouldn't that then introduce the problem of, say, wildlife that's in that water that doesn't belong in that state? So that's a whole other can of worms, even though we're just trying to help. Second question is, with all the money that you said the state of Florida has, why there's all this problem, why haven't we looked into the desalination process for Peninsula?
Two good questions. Yeah, this question of interstate transfer of water, huge, especially out west where you've got rivers, for example, like Colorado that run through many states. Here in Florida, what we call interbasin transfer or transfers between communities, for example, severe water shortages in like Hillsborough County, the Tampa area has struggled with severe water shortages for decades. And there's always the threat. Their neighboring counties are always very threatened by Hillsborough County because as Hillsborough County grows and grows and grows, their neighboring counties are very concerned that they're going to come after their water. So it's very, very controversial. And doesn't mean it doesn't happen. I mean, it does happen, but in Florida, it tends not to happen without a big fight. And Orlando, for example, is becoming the center of water gravity. It's growing like crazy, that whole I-4 corridor. And they're looking at the North Florida Springs. They're looking at, and boy, let me tell you, when you target a river, when you're a city and you say, I want to take water out of the St. Johns River, people get really backed up. And in terms of Vermont, I mean, what's happening in Vermont, flooding is a natural occurrence. I mean, there are those I don't know the specific circumstances there, but I imagine that a lot of it was that those rivers were at flood stage already. It was probably really wet. The whole system was saturated. There was no place for the drop of water to go, basically. And then the problem of gravity. There's a lot of topography in Vermont, so when water moves downhill, it moves downhill quickly, and so it becomes even more devastating. The second question was desalination. Desalination, yeah. Well, desal is expensive. It's energy intensive. So particularly when we're looking at carbon footprints to try to keep them down. It also produces a hazardous waste stream that's very difficult to get rid of. The brine that desalination produces is really difficult to dispose of and expensive to dispose of. We just haven't gotten to that point where we're at that level. We get 60 inches of rain a year. We should be able to survive on that. And the cheapest gallon of water is the gallon you don't use in the first place. And so in my opinion, as long as we are using 165 gallons per person per day, there's a lot of room for saving a lot of water. And our county, South Florida, is making a lot of progress in that regard, but it's still behind the 8 ball, really behind the 8 ball. Thank you.
Yes.
I have 2 questions. First one is for Professor Larson. What was that binding agreement that you say? I know there's a lot of non-binding agreements that were mentioned, but you mentioned one that was a binding agreement, and I can't remember.
Is it the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights?
That might have been it. Okay. And then the second question is really to all the panelists in general. I know a lot of the arguments tonight were premised on political action, legal action, and maybe even religion as a basis to get water and access to water with some grassroots support around the world. But by the time it wrestles through all those different various systems, do you think that we even need to go in that direction with a lot of things? Because there's companies out there that are making scalable technology that are offering access to water in very remote areas that don't need massive investments in infrastructure, and nations can adopt that technology, and people can, and private industries and individuals can, and even tribes can install this technology and charge residents of those areas to come and use their water. And, like, I mean, I'm no expert in anything, let alone water, but I just am thinking that by the time you put something like this in the United Nations, all these people are wrestling about it and whatnot. I think a company like Dow or GE with all this different technology that can provide sanitation from rainwater and all kinds of different things has a great opportunity to put access to water like it was never before. And this technology is scalable. It's not really expensive in the grand scheme of things. I just want to know your thoughts on that rather than the United Nations route, the religious route, the political route, and whatnot.
Yeah, actually, I think you're raising a great question, and I can kind of give you, I think I can give you an example, and you can tell me if I'm right about what you're talking about. Is I've seen some development of some reverse osmosis kiosks. They're actually solar powered, and they, through microfinancing, are actually using them for water entrepreneurs in different parts of the world. It's something that's going on in India and Bangladesh.
That's the kind of stuff that I'm talking about.
Yeah, and you know what? You're making an excellent point. But what sort of underlies it, what's the challenge for these water entrepreneurs, is still the question of, one, valuation, which is we undervalue water. And so they want to get a return on their investment, but people get so used to having government-subsidized water that they're not willing to pay more. So that's sort of one of the obstacles. And the other one is for a lot of countries, ownership of water is still a really complicated thing. So even, for example, for the development of these kiosk systems, if it's in a country like India where there isn't a really good comprehensive water rights system that says you own this much water, you can pump this much water out of this much well, then there's risks that they have that the underlying asset of their business, the water, that they can't show the deed, so to speak, and say, I actually own this water. And a third reason is there's a lot of risks out there for a water entrepreneur in terms of liability for water quality. And I'll give you an example of the way sometimes our thoughts about water quality can backfire on us. And that is, right now, the most important thing in developing countries in terms of treating your water is to get rid of microbial pathogens. So to get rid of things like Cryptosporidium and Giardia. But a lot of times you'll have big international companies or the World Bank that won't actually lend money or give money to entrepreneurs if they aren't treating water to a certain level. And treating water to a certain level in some countries is just too expensive. So if we had some system where we were saying, look, we have interim standards, and in the short term, if these entrepreneurs can reach this level of treatment so that it's safe enough that people aren't getting Cryptosporidium and Giardia, then maybe we can get to the point where we start worrying about the things Americans worry about in their water quality, which is disinfectant byproducts. We have the luxury of worrying about that, but a lot of people don't.
Was there a follow-up?
Can I just say something about, I think you did a fantastic job, that's exactly right. Just as a way of example, here in South Florida, we pay about $1.50 per 1,000 gallons of water from the Everglades. Reverse osmosis, if you were to get that water from the Florida aquifer, and if you were going to have to apply RO, it goes to $7 to $8 per 1,000 gallons. People aren't willing to pay it. I mean, your average county commissioner, they try to put $1 a month surcharge on a water bill that's, get the bums out. People are used to here, at least here, are accustomed to heavily subsidized water supply. They're not willing to pay for it.
It sounds like a tragedy of prosperity we have over here. But this does touch on an earlier point, though, about the sort of, I think many of you talked about sort of this tragedy of the commons idea, that by having common ownership of water, that sort of leads to an incentive or disincentive to conserve water, which may not be a big deal, as you said before. I think places like Vermont or in Denver, Colorado, it becomes a bigger deal as you move south towards Florida, further south into Mexico, into Texas, where there are fires burning all the time, and into other countries where you don't have the same sort of pure water. It's just an interesting issue, sort of connecting sort of this tragedy of commons with water usage, and sort of it seems like I'm hearing partially from your read these sort of free market solution to use of water? Is that what you're suggesting on some level?
Well, I mean, just like with cap and trade, there's thoughts about, first of all, the valuation of water, and if water reflects its true value, people will conserve it. In fact, if you read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, there's this portion in it where he talks about the water-diamond paradox. He says, diamonds don't do a friggin' thing for anybody, and yet we value them like they're the greatest thing in the whole wide world, whereas water is like the most important thing in the whole universe, and we literally flush it down the toilet. And that's sort of it's the funny thing about it is if we truly valued water for what it really was, people would treat it better. But there are solutions, and one of them is arguably maybe we should treat water as a valuable resource, but then there are equity considerations, which are how easy is it for some people to afford clean, sufficient water supplies?
I want to get someone, Christian.
Yeah, I have a question for either Professor or Mr. Larson. How would you enforce water as a right against, I'll say, underdeveloped countries? I know that when you are talking about developed countries, you can put sanctions on trade and things like that, so they will have to get in line. And you talk about the reasonableness of the water use. If in another developed country, they say that they need this much water for an economy to survive, and in order to take that water, they take it away from people. So how does that come into play with the reasonableness? And how do you enforce that against a country, another developed country, that will not suffer as much as a developed country in terms of tariffs or sanctions, economic sanctions for trade?
Well, let me respond first. There are a couple of ways in which your question actually raises all kinds of complicated issues, but a couple of ways to think about it. First of all, in terms of rights, when it deals with the government and rights, then typically a right in that form would be phrased in terms of being able to give people access to water to the extent of available resources. And so governments, in response to those situations, would, of course, in a place where it was not possible to supply adequate water, would simply say, well, we've done all we can do. And the power of the right would be to try to force them to live up to that promise of doing all they could with available resources. The second part that you made me think about was that, part of the underlying debate here, which also crosses over into the economics of it all, is about competing needs for the water or competing demands on water. So industrial or agricultural usage will butt up against, especially in the developing world, the needs of individuals, especially, and this is really where the power of this whole idea comes, for those who really are not without, they don't have the means. And so this is really a poverty-driven idea. And then when they're in conflict with these industrial uses, the power of the right would be a demand on some institution that, apart from these industrial or agricultural uses, this is more important. It trumps those interests, so that at minimum, people have to have a certain basic access to water and sanitation. And so you, in a way, you try to resolve part of the conflict. I don't know if you have more response to that.
Was that good enough?
All right, next. I don't know if your hand is up or no, your hand is up. No. Oh, go ahead.
I just wondered if there was a working definition of clean water, because I think that outside of the whole legal enforceability concept, that's going to cause a huge conflict in regards to the economic and even the physical impacts of you have to know what you're working with before you can even talk about the feasibility of implementing anything like this.
So what is clean water? What do we mean?
That's a really good question.
Even in the United States of America, that definition varies across borders because each state has authority under the Clean Water Act to establish its own surface water quality standards. And so what's clean water in New Mexico isn't necessarily clean water in Arizona. And certainly what's clean water in France isn't necessarily clean water in Kenya. So it literally varies by a matter of just stepping across the border sometimes.
It's a great point. I wish I'd thought of it.
You know, what's interesting is in the world of ecosystem restoration, actually, that's one of the things that ecosystem restoration gets you, is it gets you cleaner water than if you're doing water treatment for human consumption. The level, the easiest way to think about it is 125-pound human can take a lot more contaminant than a 6-pound bird or an 8-ounce fish. And so micro-constituents, for example, are particularly worrisome, we think, maybe not for human beings, but for wildlife and food chain.
Well, I think there was an answer that was given early on that at the very least, what you were saying is, at the very least, it means you don't have certain pathogens in there.
Well, I think that is, I mean, the idea that, you know, by the time we're done talking tonight, 6,000 children will have died from diarrhea. And when you think about the amount of money that goes into researching on issues like HIV and cancer, and how little money actually goes to solving this problem, you ask yourself, what's the difference? And the difference is, rich people get HIV and cancer, but only poor people die of diarrhea. Rich people don't die of diarrhea. So rich people don't eat causes that scare them, because it could come back to them. So, you know, I think to be able to make the idea of what clean water really means is it's that baseline, which is Giardia, Cryptosporidium, E. coli. I mean, these are killers. I mean, the deadliest animal on the face of the earth is the Anopheles mosquito. And why? Because it's the water-breeding vector that gives people malaria. And, you know, we think about, you know, we got to watch out for crocodiles and great whites, but we got to watch out for mosquitoes.
You know, there's a lot of positive things also, by the way, with organizations like the Gates Foundation, who have really figured out that if you really want to help people around the world, that's where you ought to stick your resources. So they've done a tremendous amount and spent a lot of money on exactly these kinds of issues.
Yeah, especially malaria. The Gates Foundation's been fantastic.
We're fortunate in America, speaking of our position of relative privilege here, we're fortunate in America we don't have to worry about malaria. We got rid of that long ago. So maybe in some ways we sort of lose sight of it. And that's a waterborne illness, but borne by way of mosquitoes that live in the water and swamps, right? So that really sort of brings full circle to a lot of what we've been talking about here. Tonight was meant to introduce us to sort of the background regarding water. What is water? What is a water right? What is clean water? And as you can see, just like much of what we discuss in law school generally, but when we start talking about policy arguments in any context, those definitions can be somewhat slippery, right? But we at least have some anchors to go forward with as we continue our discussion tomorrow regarding sort of the application. What does this mean in context? And some of our presenters tomorrow are going to be talking about the water rights in Kenya, water rights in Haiti, water rights and what do they mean in terms of human health. Following up, continuing with Dr. Nan Palmer's discussion about water and human health, we're going to have a continuing discussion about the human health implications tomorrow. So I hope that you can all come back and even bring some friends. We got the largest lecture hall at Nova Southeastern Law Center to hold this event. I'm excited about the turnout. Give yourselves a round of applause. And give our expert panelists a round of applause for coming out. So before we close, I'd like to remind you that the IACHR puts on events like this. We have this big event tonight. We want to continue to have more events. Our student co-directors, Melanie Millay and Victor Palacios, have done an incredible job. But we want to be able to continue to do these sorts of things. Please support the T-shirt fundraiser. T-shirts are only $10. Pick one up. They're going to be available at the doors, or in the same room where you went to get some food earlier. And also, please support Rhonda Long's Rhonda Long's artwork. She's donated, so the proceeds are going to come back to IACHR. And the bidding starts actually for this piece, which is our a signature piece on all our advertising for $100. So Denny starts at $100. They actually valued $800, but she donated to us, and we're very grateful. This will go a long way. The silent auction and the T-shirt sales go a long way towards allowing us to continue to host these sorts of events free of charge. I know we talked a little bit about the free market and everything else, but in this situation, we value education so highly, education on these rights so highly, human rights, that we would prefer not to have to charge anybody to attend. We want to share this knowledge, share the knowledge of our expert panels with everybody. So please take a moment. If you have the money, put in a bid, at least buy a T-shirt. It's only $10. We'd really appreciate it. With that, thank you.